My name is Kristen Himelein. I'm a senior economist and statistician at the World Bank based in Washington, D.C. I am the task team leader for the Pacific Poverty Program, and I'm here today to talk about monetary-based poverty measurement recommendations for the Pacific. The objective of this presentation is to explain the rationale for monetary poverty measurement, which is Sustainable Development Goal 1.1.1 and Sustainable Development Goal 1.2.1, and lay out a set of draft recommendations that adapt international best practice to the unique Pacific context. The content of this presentation draws from decades of research and technical assistance that the World Bank has offered to countries around the world, including the Pacific, the vast survey methodology literature, as well as results from a consumption experiment that we did in the Republic of the Marshall Islands and which was presented at the May 2019 Pacific Statistics Methods Board meeting in Auckland. A quick introduction to monetary poverty. Poverty is an incredibly complex and culturally specific concept, which is hard to quantify for a single country, much less develop a measure which permits comparisons across disparate contexts across the world. Comparable measures are needed, though, to monitor global progress in poverty reduction and for development partners and governments to target interventions. One measure that is used to inform these decisions is monetary poverty, which can either be based on income or consumption. So, monetary poverty and the Sustainable Development Goals. There are three Sustainable Development Goals that relate to poverty measurement. The first one, SDG 1.1.1, is the proportion of the population below the international poverty line by sex, age, employment status, and geographic location. This, we use the international poverty line, which I will talk about more in a minute. For Sustainable Development Goal 1.2.1, which is the proportion of the population living below the national poverty line by sex and age, we use a national poverty line, which I will touch on the development of today as well. Finally, there's Sustainable Development Goal 1.2.2, which is the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions. This is a non-monetary or multidimensional measure, and it's calculated differently than what I will talk about here today. There are resources available to assist you with this, but unfortunately it will not be covered in this presentation. Starting with international poverty lines. The current international poverty line is $1.90 per person per day, adjusted using the 2011 purchasing power parity, and it was introduced in September 2015. As companions to the IPL, the World Bank also measures poverty based on the lower middle income poverty line, which is $3.20 per capita per day, and the upper middle income poverty line, which is $5.50 per capita per day. The reason that we have an IPL is that research has shown that as countries become better off, their poverty line tends to increase. In this way, we couldn't use national poverty lines to compare countries because better off countries would have higher poverty lines, and we couldn't make international comparisons. The first international poverty line was $1 per day, developed in 1991 using the 1985 purchasing power parity numbers, and has been adjusted since. So when we came to the time to update for this set of PPP numbers, we again did the original calculations, which looked at the poverty lines for the 15 poorest countries for which data is available, and compared that to an inflation-adjusted measure of the original. And we found that $1.90 was an extremely robust measure, and hence it became the new international poverty line for the updated PPPs. Global poverty monitoring is important because, as this graph shows, there's been substantial reductions in poverty, particularly in the East Asia-Pacific region, driven by the rise of China, since we started calculating these measures in the early 80s. This graph shows, in orange, the decline in the East Asia-Pacific region. Without an international poverty line to facilitate comparable measures, we would not be able to do this type of analysis. National poverty is actually a little bit different, though. The international poverty line is not useful for national measures because generally it is quite low. We need a national context-specific line that is used for domestic and regional policymaking. In order to develop a national measure of monetary poverty, an analyst requires two types of data. The first is a consumption aggregate, and the second is a cost of basic needs poverty line. I should note that not all countries use consumption. Some use income instead, and in the Pacific, Fiji uses income. The process is the same, you're just using a different underlying measure. Each household has its own consumption aggregate. When these values are graphed, the result is the consumption distribution. The poverty line crosses the consumption distribution, and all those households living below the poverty line are considered poor. The World Bank recommends a cost of basic needs poverty line, which is based on a basket of food actually consumed by poor people, rather than an idealized basket based on nutritional requirements. A quick overview of what consumption aggregates generally look like in the Pacific region. This stylized example shows that food comprises 40%, non-food about 35%, rent about 20%, education, health, and durable goods make up the remaining 5%. In addition, historically, transfers out of the household or gifts given have been included. This is, however, not considered best practice, and we will recommend against doing this in the future. That component of the poverty of the consumption aggregate, though, was at about an additional 5%. So let's talk about food consumption. Purchased, produced, received, and eaten away from home. There are many different types of ways that people consume food that we need to quantify for monetary poverty measurement. The first step is to set up all food spending in the household, including purchased foods, adjusting for a diary, and I'll speak about that more in a minute, the market price equivalent for home-produced food, the market price equivalent for in-kind food payments, gift of foods, and rations, which is a growing issue as there are more displaced populations and as the challenge of global climate change increases, and food purchased and consumed outside the household. I mentioned purchased food adjusting for stocks if necessary because the recent experiment in the Marshall Islands has shown that this is an area in which data collection is increasingly problematic. In order to use a diary to collect data, we have to collect both the opening and closing stock as well as the purchases that the household makes between these 2 points in time. For example, if a household has 1 kilogram of flour at the start, purchases 3 kilograms during the diary period, and then has 2 kilograms at the end, it would not be the 3 kilograms that they purchased that they would consume, but rather only 2 kilograms. We must adjust for the stocks. The evidence from the Marshall Islands, though, however, shows that there's a net destocking. And we wouldn't expect this. We would expect some households to go up and some households to go down. So we'd expect the center around 0. Because we see this net destocking, we hypothesize that there are issues with the data collection. And therefore, this is one of the reasons that we recommend moving to recall data collection over diary data collection. So to talk a little bit about prepared meals, or food consumed away from home, this graph shows the different types of places where prepared meals can be consumed. Meals can be consumed at home but prepared elsewhere, and this includes purchased and received in kind food. You can also have food that's purchased and consumed away from home. This could be restaurant meals, street vendors, as well as free meals received as part of an employment package or in schools. It is important that all types of prepared meals that are consumed outside the household or purchased and brought into the household or received and brought into the household are captured in the consumption aggregate. This includes meals for which the household goes to visit friends or relatives and receives a meal for free. Non-food consumption. Non-food consumption is a large topic, but I will touch on just a few of the highlights here today. First, let's talk about what is eligible under non-food spending. All eligible non-food spending is the spending that the household makes on non-food purchases, but excludes a few key items. We exclude lumpy expenditures. These are large but infrequent purchases, such as weddings, births, deaths, hospitalizations. Difficult to cost items, such as public services or leisure time. Investment and other business-related expenses, as these expenses are not about consumption, but rather about future consumption. Repayment of loans, interest payments, purchase of financial assets, and taxes for similar reasons, and transfers out of the household, including gifts, remittances, and religious contributions. Talking about lumpy expenditure, consider the example we have on the slide. A poor household has one child, a daughter. The daughter decides to marry at age 22, and the family pays for a lavish wedding as per the local custom. The wedding is partially paid by selling some household assets and partially paid by borrowing. As you can see from the graph, consumption is pretty steady before the age of 22. There is a large spike at the age of 22, and then consumption returns to a fairly steady level, though slightly lower, after the wedding as the family repays the loans, and this impacts their consumption. The well-being of the household does not fundamentally change because of a week in which they celebrate the wedding. Therefore, we want to exclude this lumpy expenditure as the household does not suddenly become rich just for 1 year before returning to its original status. Transfers out of the household or gifts given. The inclusion of transfers out of the household is one area in which the historic method of poverty estimation in the Pacific diverges from international best practices. From an intuitive perspective, monetary poverty focuses on spending to promote the material good of the household, so therefore it doesn't make sense to include gifts given. From a strictly accounting perspective, since transfers out are accounted as gifts received by other households, the household that receives the transfer, measuring them in both aggregates would be double counting. The quote that we generally turn to is from Deaton and Zaidi 2002, which is considered the seminal paper on poverty measurement based on consumption. And the quote is, "Average living standards could be increased without limit if each household were simply encouraged to donate its income to another household, and so on. Nothing would have changed except for our measure of welfare." So for example, think about 5 households that live in a circle. You could take $100 and hand it between household to household. The household would count the $100 given out as part of their consumption if we included this in the measure. At the end, you could take the $100 away, nothing would have fundamentally changed, but we would show $100 higher in each of the consumption aggregates. For this reason, we recommend excluding gifts given from the consumption aggregates. Health spending. Health spending is a complicated topic, as certain aspects should certainly be included because they are welfare enhancing, such as preventative care and cosmetic procedures, and certain aspects excluded as they are lumpy expenditures, such as hospitalization. Other spending, including doctor visits and treatment for illness, could be considered either welfare enhancing and included, or a regrettable necessity and excluded. Deaton and Zaidi 2002 recommends basing this decision on the elasticities. To talk a little bit more about the intuition behind health spending, I take the following hypothetical story. There are 3 neighbors. At the start of the year, all 3 households have identical levels of welfare. But then household heads 2 and 3 fall ill, and the theoretical welfare loss is shown here in red. Household 2 does not seek treatment, but household 3 spends money to go to a doctor to purchase medication. The paradox is that if health spending is included, household 3 looks better off than household 1, even though all they did was pay to recover the health they lost. But if health spending is excluded, all 3 households look the same, even though household 3 received treatment and household 2 did not, and household 1 did not fall ill at all. As I mentioned, the decision to include is based on elasticities. Generally, at the original time that the paper was done, health elasticities were quite low, below 1. Here are the elasticities for a selected group of countries in the Pacific. As you can see, with the exception of the Solomon Islands, health elasticities are generally high, over 1 and in most cases over 2. Education spending has many of the same issues. Again, we turn to the elasticities to try to make a decision on inclusion. And again, we see elasticities that are relatively high, over 1 in most cases. It is based on these recommendations, or these elasticities, that we generally recommend for the inclusion of most health spending and most education spending, though the final decisions on these recommendations are still pending further analysis. Accounting for assets. So a consumption aggregate includes 2 other values that are not purchases. One is the use value of household assets, and the other is the rental equivalent. These 2 values are important parts of the consumption aggregate, particularly in places like the Pacific, where many households meet their food needs readily and easily. These measures are calculated instead of collected. Excluding these measures has a tendency to overstate poverty and understate equality. Let's take the example of a bicycle. Between the date of purchase and the date of sale, the household uses the bicycle for transportation, for entertainment. If we just conducted the survey, the reference period may not capture the purchase of the bicycle, but the household still enjoys the use of the bicycle during the reference period. So use value is just a way of quantifying and adding the use value of the asset during the time that the household has it, captured in the reference period. This table shows the use value of durables for the 2018 Maldives survey. As you can see, some values are quite high, indicating that the household gets a high use value of the asset, and some are quite low. We use this to account for the different assets owned by the household and get an accurate measure of inequality. The second measure is imputed rent. Households clearly benefit from having and living in a shelter. In the case of those that rent their dwelling, it is easy to estimate the value that they receive, as it is equal to the rent, with the caveat that some contexts employers provide free or subsidized housing, and we need to take that into account. But there are only certain areas of the country where renting is common, mainly in urban areas. Most households own their homes. Since it makes sense to include rent for those that pay at market prices, but what is the best method for calculating the equivalent for homeowners? This process is generally quite long and quite involved analytically. We have this flowchart here which summarizes the process. Since there are no universally perfect places for few renters, this is our recommended approach. We ask the analysts to ask 3 questions. Are there different rental markets in different parts of the country? This means, would the same house rent for different prices in different parts of the country, or are there fundamentally different types of housing in different parts of the country? If the answer is yes, the analyst should divide the data into the different markets and then proceed with the calculations accordingly. If no, the analyst can proceed with the full data set. Are there enough renters to develop a reliable model? If yes, the model should be developed based on the actual rental values. If no, it's necessary to incorporate the estimated rental values from the owners. Now, the survey literature has shown that the estimated values of housing for owners is universally higher than the actual rented values. This is something that's been demonstrated in context across the world and which we further see in the Pacific. In the case where the rental values differ significantly from the estimated values of the owners, what we generally recommend doing is dropping the actual values and using the estimated values to have a consistent measure for all households. This does distort the truth a little bit for some households, those that actually rent, but it is at the cost of having a consistent measure for all households, and it is considered that it is better to have a consistent measure for all households than have a perfectly accurate measure for only a small number of households. With these measures, the consumption aggregate is the annualized sum of food spending, eligible non-food spending, and the use value of durables and imputed rents. It is then necessary to put these totals into per capita or per adult equivalent terms and apply spatial and temporal price deflators. Adult equivalent measures are often used in the calculation of national poverty lines to account for differences in food requirements of adults and children, as opposed to per capita measures which assume all household members to require the same number of calories. Adult equivalents are particularly common in contexts with young populations, which is many of the countries in the Pacific. The Pacific has historically used the OECD measure, which defines adults as those aged 15 and older, and children as those aged under 15. Children are then considered to consume at 1/2 the rate of adults. Something new that has arisen in the survey literature is the idea of partakers. In contexts where there's multiple members of the household that take meals in other households, or people from outside the household that takes meals within the household, it is necessary to adjust for partakers. Shown on the slide are the questions that facilitate the calculation of the number of partakers. As there is high incidence of meal sharing in the Pacific, we recommend also including partakers in your adjustments for household size. Deflators. Since the cost of living differs from one part of the country to another, and there may be seasonal variation in prices faced by households, analysts usually apply spatial, based on geography, or temporal, based on time, deflators, or both, to the consumption aggregates so that they are comparable across the country. An alternative is to calculate separated poverty lines, but since this does not allow for inequality analysis, it is not generally considered international best practice. So once we have these adjustments, both the household equivalents or per capita and the price deflator, we adjust the consumption aggregate so we have a comparable consumption aggregate for all households in the country. We then begin the process of calculating a poverty line. As I mentioned, the international poverty line has been set. It's $1.90 per day adjusted for purchasing power parity. The process of calculating a national poverty line is fairly complicated, and so I will only touch on a few of the high-level ideas here. Step 1 is to calculate the food component of the cost of basic needs poverty line by pricing a food basket based on the consumption of the relevant reference population and the caloric requirements of the national population. So what's important here is we first focus on food, pricing a food basket, and this is because we are able to compare the value of that food basket across different parts of the country, whereas it's much more difficult to do that with a non-food basket. We then look at a relevant reference population. So in choosing your relevant reference population, you always drop the first and the highest and lowest deciles of the population as their consumption patterns vary from the majority, and then you generally try to find the 2 to 3 deciles around your final poverty line. Then there's the caloric requirements. Caloric requirements can vary, and the FAO has recommendations, but it is necessary to choose a value. The second step is to establish the relationship between food and non-food spending, and use that to calculate the non-food component of the poverty line. We combine these two measures to form the cost of basic needs poverty line. Step 3 is to apply to the consumption aggregate and perform poverty analysis. So as I mentioned, the caloric requirements of the national population can vary. Here are the requirements for a few countries as defined by the FAO. As you can see, Fiji is higher at 1,860 calories, whereas Vanuatu is low at 1,730. Many analysts consider these not to be realistic calorie requirements, so often a different measure is used. 2,100 is common, as is 2,400. We are recommending a universal measure for the Pacific, though we have not yet determined what it is. The food poverty line. Here are the steps in calculating the food poverty line. Start with the basket shares. Determine how those basket shares translate into calories for a given minimum calorie requirement. Look up the calories per 100 grams of each item. Determine the number of grams needed to reach the shares of the calories. Use a survey to determine the cost per 100 gram. Determine the total cost per item, cost times amount, and sum over all items in the basket. As I noted, food away from home is an important share of the consumption basket, but it is difficult to accurately calculate the calories. There are two main approaches. The first is to incorporate a restaurant survey into HEISS data collection. This approach collects the consumption of common restaurant and street vendor meals by location, which are then converted into calories. An alternative is making the assumption that per calorie cost of food away from home is the same as the per calorie cost of food prepared and consumed at home, and that the composition of food eaten in restaurants is similar to that prepared at home. This is an area of further research that we have not yet finalized the recommendations. Finally, determining the non-food component requires complex calculations. There are a number of different methods that are used for this, most of which are based on the work of researcher Martin Ravalian. There are 3 that we consider the most common. This is the regression method based on an Engels curve, a Ravalian non-parametric upper poverty line, and a Ravalian non-parametric lower poverty line. We are still in the process of finalizing these recommendations for the Pacific. Finally, a note on how the calculations are done. Regardless of the decisions made in the calculation of the consumption aggregate and poverty line, it is essential that an analyst use software capable of handling the calculations and correctly maintaining a record of the steps. Possible choices include Stata, R, SAS, and other statistical analysis packages. Excel, while useful for some parts of the analysis, cannot be used for core calculations as it is not significantly powerful to do the rent calculations, and it cannot account for the complex design of the surveys. All of the JU or R files that are used in the construction and analysis of the poverty measures should be archived as part of the survey documentation process. The following slides have the recommendations that we have currently for poverty measurement in the Pacific. SDG 1.1.1 should be measured using the U.S. $1.90 per purchasing power parity per capita per day international poverty line. SDG 1.2.1 should be measured using a national cost of basic needs poverty line based in national survey data. Food consumption should include purchases, including prepared meals and food consumed away from home, gift receives, food provided in kind, home production, and rations. Non-food consumption should include the use value of assets, imputed rent, education spending, health spending on preventative and elective procedures, but exclude lumpy expenditures, investment, loans, interest, taxes, transfers out of the household, including gifts, remittances, and religious contributions. Imputed rent should be calculated using the proposed decision path to account for local price differences and compensate for owners' tendency to overvalue their dwelling. Countries should continue to use the OECD per adult equivalent instead of per capita measures to adjust consumption aggregate for household composition. Household composition should further be adjusted to take into account partakers. The reference population for the consumption basket should always include the top and bottom decile, and otherwise use an iterative approach to determine the correct part of the distribution. Poverty analysis should be done using FGT measures, including poverty headcount, poverty gap, and poverty severity. All cleaning and calculations should be done using replicable methods in a statistical analysis program such as Stata or R. The DO or Stata RStudio files should be retained and archived along with the dataset. On the screen now are a list of questions that are further resources is needed. We have not yet finalized these recommendations, but anticipate a full set of guidelines will be available by the next Pacific Statistics Methods Board meeting to be held in April 2020 in Auckland, New Zealand. We look forward to having the finalized set of recommendations so that further training and more detailed information can be rolled out across the region. Thank you very much for your time and attention.